still is a challenge. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all the definitions mentioned, you can see it in this picture, acquired new meanings, at least for a while. Very soon, however, Europe divided came to the fore once again. Oops. The East-West paradigm didn't disappear, it's just moved east, and that's when and where the new Eastern Europe paradigm reappeared for the third time, if only I'm not mistaken. This is just one example of how much historians are dependent on the changing political and geopolitical context. National stereotypes and historical legacies still inform competing visions of Europe in general and Eastern Europe in particular. This is how Europe can be seen from the Western perspective. United States. This is Germany. Try to find Ukraine, it would be easy. And you know, of course, this picture. This is an opposite view, how the Eastern Europe can be seen from a Russian side, from Russia. This is just another version of Russia and Eastern Europe, and another one. And we now, you know, that the only countries that produced an alternative federalist concept of the region in between was Poland, with the concept of intermarium between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. I beg you, please don't take it seriously. Last time I showed some of this picture, I was accused of being, I cannot remember exactly, some sort of nationalism or biased, I believe. To sum up, history once again determines the geography of Europe in general and its eastern borderland in particular. The other question, geopolitics of identity, sometimes been reduced to the geopolitics of memory. There are two main supranational geopolitical projects, the pan-European one and the Russian Eurasian or Russian Orthodox one. They reappeared after the breakup of the communist system. Each of them is based on a certain version of identity with its own set of symbols and symbolic spaces. The remapping and re-identification of the whole European space in this period is comparable only with what went on in the period after the Second World War. So it is no wonder that both the European Union and the Ruski Mir concepts or projects are based on certain interpretations of the Second World War. This is just to remind you how the region in question can be possibly understood and presented or conceptualized. The European Union was, after all, born out of the memory of the war, its large-scale violence and atrocity. European memory is based on the Holocaust and the German sense of historical guilt. In a word, it's based on a feeling of war trauma. In the case of the former Soviet Union, well, the Great Fatherland War paradigm was the most likely combination of the Imperial Orthodox and Soviet concepts. Russian Soviet memory is based on the heroic discourse of the war, of the victory, the great victory, Великая Победа. In fact, they overlapped. That is why the historical legacy of the Second World War still shapes the rhetoric and thinking of political elites on both sides of Huntington's dividing line. Just a couple of examples. Greek-German tensions during the recent economic crisis revived Greek memories and discourses and rhetoric of the German Nazi occupation. The Speaker of the Polish Parliament, Radosław Sikorski, compared the recent pipeline deal between Germany and Russia to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Russian President Vladimir Putin, while launching his airstrikes on Syria, tried to appeal to the discourse of the anti-Hitlerite coalition of the Second World War. In 2003, British parliamentarians arguing for the invasion of Iraq drew their arguments from analogies to the appeasement of Hitler. And maybe it's an irony that the very name of the Normandy format of negotiations over the Donbass conflict bears some relation to the Normandy landings of the Second World War. However, the Soviet-Russian paradigm of the Second World War is still dominant on former Soviet territory. It is a well-known fact that the historical legitimacy of the Soviet Union was underpinned by two mythologies, those of the Great October Socialist Revolution and of the Great Fatherland War, Великая Отечественная война. The Brezhnev era aspired to synthesize the Leninist and Stalinist historical mythologies, but in fact favored the latter, the Stalinist one. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Soviet legacy in terms of both time and space, geography and history has been nationalized and reinterpreted in the respective national historical narratives, including the Russian one. It was predicted long ago that in the process of desovietization of historical writing, the interpretation of the Second World War would sooner or later become the main point of departure for national historiographies diverging from the Soviet paradigms of the Great Victory and of the friendship of peoples to nationally informed and nationally shaped paradigms. From this historical perspective, one can see how different the Soviet republics were and how diverse are their strategies of coming to terms with the recent past. For Russia, the mythology of the Second World War is of primary importance. It's a founding myth colored with anti-Western and orthodox sentiments and militarism. It's safe to say that the former Soviet-Russian mythology has now turned into the Russian-Soviet mythology of the Great Victory. Belarus is also following the same template, with an emphasis on the Soviet and territorial components. There is some debris of the Soviet Union, so to speak, scattered on former Soviet imagined and real political territory. I mean, of course, the, so to say, unrecognized or self-proclaimed polities whose identities are also based on the Soviet legacy and the historical mythology of the Великая Отечественная война, the Great Fatherland War, namely Transnistria, the Donbass, and some of the same proclaimed republics in the region of Caucasia. This is Transnistria. And of course, you can recognize this is Donbass, and this is a short history in pictures of how a Soviet tank named Iosif Stalin was removed from a memorial complex to the Великая Отечественная война and re-employed against the Ukrainian army recently by the Donbass separatists. Later on, it was recaptured and has been put on display by Ukrainian soldiers in the Museum of Arms in Kyiv. And this is another picture. Dozens of Ukrainian soldiers were marched through Donetsk along Artyom Street to Lenin Square to imitate or to rerun Stalin's parade of Nazi prisoners of war in Moscow 71 years ago during the Second World War. I would say that all the self-proclaimed republics are following the Russian strategy of nationalizing the Great Patriotic War, the Great Fatherland War, by combining the Russian version of orthodoxy with the good old Soviet anti-fascist historical narrative. Some of the other Orthodox countries, such as Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, have been maneuvering between Soviet and national visions of the recent past. The three Baltic republics are trying to squeeze the Soviet legacy out of their national narratives altogether. They draw upon the analytical concepts of occupation and resistance, totalitarianism and colonialism, and have adopted the model of two evils, being trapped between communism and nationalism. And now a couple of words about Ukraine. In terms of geopolitics, Western analysts, following in the footsteps of Zbigniew Brzezinski, assigned Ukraine a pivotal role in maintaining the security of the region between the European Union and post-Soviet Russia. They assumed that without Ukraine, Russia wouldn't be able to revive as an empire hostile to the West, provided, of course, that the Ukrainian project was successful. However, Ukraine again turned into a battlefield of two competing European and Russian visions of the East European borderland. The East-West paradigm has taken on new life on Ukrainian territory. Over the last 20 years or so, we have seen the imagined border between East and West shift gradually from western to eastern Ukraine. Today, it has stopped at the new Ukrainian-Russian border in the Donbas region. This is where Ukraine is trying to present itself as the last true European antemurale, with Russia still excluded from Europe. As for competing the Second World War and the Great Fatherland War paradigms in the Ukrainian context, it is obvious that the Ukrainian case seems much more complicated than the Polish and Baltic ones. In Ukraine, all attempts to nationalize or squeeze out the Soviet-Russian mythology of the Great Fatherland War have produced mixed results so far. Ukraine was tied to its recent past not by one but by two threats, Soviet and Russian. It seemed that rejecting one of these threats would also mean rejecting the other. Let me skip the issue of the Polish-Ukrainian conflict with all its ramifications, as well as the issue of the Holocaust. Prior to the last Maidan revolution, the collective historical consciousness of Ukrainian society showed ever greater dependence on Russian identity politics, in which historical amnesia and glorification of Stalinism prevail. At the same time, Ukrainian intellectuals, following East European strategies of memory, adopted the paradigm of two evils, Nazism and communism, Hitler and Stalin. With the ОУН УПА, Організація українських націоналістів, Українська повстанська армія, as the main representative of national heroic resistance to both of them. However, the problem of the OUN and UPA involves sensitive issues of nationalism, fascism, collaborationism, ethnic cleansing, and the Holocaust. In fact, the OUN-UPA historical legacy is itself being mythologized, or sometimes even demonized and broadly exploited by political manipulators. This is Kharkiv, monuments to UPA destroyed recently. This is another picture, it's Munich, with the same results. The attempts of some Ukrainian historians to integrate the problem of OUN-UPA into the national narrative of the Second World War also have not produced satisfactory results so far. To date, Ukrainian academic historiography has not succeeded in nationalizing the Soviet mythology of the Great Fatherland War. Removing or destroying monuments to Lenin is one thing, but dealing with monuments to heroes of the Great Fatherland War is another. This picture is made in Kharkiv this year. This one is from Donbas, Kramatorsk city, a monument colored with Ukrainian blue-yellow national colors, but with a fresh inscription, DNR, Donetskaya Народная Республика, Donetsk People's Republic. This inscription was erased, but after that, another anti-fascist slogan appeared, No pasarán, borrowed from the Spanish Civil War symbolical context. According to data collected by the Razumkov Center, about 75% of Ukrainian residents 5 years ago considered Victory Day a major holiday. The rhetoric employed by today's propaganda war in the Donbass only serves to confirm the level of influence of the Great Fatherland War discourse on the Ukrainian historical consciousness. This is an example of propaganda war. And I would say that indeed, both warring sides are borrowing heavily from the images and symbols of the Soviet propaganda arsenal, comparing their opponents to fascists and describing their military victories in such terms as the Battle of Stalingrad, this is Ukrainian Battle of Stalingrad, or the defense of the Brest fortress, like Donetsk airport. The Ukrainian-Russian war of memory could satisfy Ukrainian national building needs only if it were waged on a European basis and respective politics of identity. However, switching from the Great Fatherland War paradigm to the Second World War paradigm would require a radical modification of Ukrainian national discourse, if not an outright rejection of its main postulates, as well as a rejection of the heroic narrative in favor of a more grounded socio-cultural one. The de-Sovietization of the historical discourse of the Great Fatherland War requires the desacralization of history and historical narrative in general. So what is to be done and who's to blame? Is history back? Are we facing a new Cold War? And is there a prospect of another Yalta, Potsdam, or Nuremberg? I would subscribe to the notion that historical legacies play a crucial role in shaping different patterns of post-communist economic, political, and cultural developments in Eastern Europe. However, the question arises, do discussions of World War II constitute a unifying or a dividing factor in European politics? This is a long quote from citation from German historian Stefan Berger. At least it's worth to consider, is it possible at all to get rid of these biases, stereotypes, and paradigms of the recent past. As to geography, Ukrainian space shares almost all the particularities and historical fate of the entire East European borderland. It's just an extension of East European borderland. Its ever-changing political configurations, cultural heterogeneity, polycentrism, transparency, and so on and so forth. Practically all the basic features of the East European borderland, with its dialectic of unity and regional variety, ambivalence and polycentrism, hybrid cultural identities, shifting borders, and so on, are already present in the post-Soviet Ukrainian historical narrative. If so, do we really need the concept of Eastern Europe as an analytical tool? Don't you think that it's time to replace it with the Eurasian borderland paradigm, or anti-paradigm, as Mark von Hagen and recently Alfred Rieber have suggested? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kravchenko. I will try to limit my own remarks to a minimum to allow people to ask questions, since our time is very limited. I found the various perspectives on the geography or geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe to be fascinating, and humor apart, it really provides very, good food for thought, these various perspectives of what would appear to be, objectively defined, territories. I would actually try to broaden that, and the idea came to me only in the course of listening to Professor Kravchenko. And that is when I look at 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union, we have yet another very major change in the region, and that is in the broader Black Sea region. Until that time, one could look at the Black Sea as either historically, either as an Ottoman lake, which it was for several centuries, or basically a Russian Ottoman or Russian Turkish or Soviet Turkish condominium. In 1991, for the first time in history, there appeared 7 literal states on the Black Sea. And in fact, Ukraine became, in terms of the coastal area, the largest literal state after Turkey. And in great part, that was the result of, again, an event connected with World War II, and that is the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from Crimea and the subsequent transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. And with that also came the return of the Crimean Tatars after 1991 to a country, to a different country than the one that they had left. When they were deported, Crimea, the Autonomous Republic, was part of Russia. They returned to Crimea as part of Ukraine. And Ukraine, therefore, assumed a role in the Black Sea region that was quite different than anything that it had before. I think that this is something that also has to be taken into account. And I, as an apostle of Omelian Pritsak, who said that the role of Turkey and Crimea, the Ottoman Empire and the Black Sea, has been much undervalued in historical scholarship in Ukraine. This should remind us of the dimension, the historical dimension of the Ukrainian South and the role of the Black Sea. In some ways, it also interconnects with the notion of the Polish notion of intermarium, because as Lech Walesa, in the early 90s saw it, the Eastern Europe bloc of nations that we saw from that map would reach the Black Sea. And of course, it is just a hop and skip or a boat ride across to the Bosphorus. And now with the new president in Poland, there are rumblings occasionally of something like a new intermarium model reemerging. So my question would be, based on that, is how do you feel, Professor Kravchenko, about broadening the geographical scope of post-World War II and post-Soviet Ukraine into this region? And then I hope we will have questions from the audience as well. Well, maybe since time is limited, we'll probably take them one by one rather than bundling, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Dr. Haida, for this question. I know you were and are in favor of this Black Sea orientation of Ukrainian internal and foreign policy. But to be realistic, I don't think that any Black Sea-oriented geopolitical schema would be much more attractive at the moment for Ukrainians comparing with the European orientation and this recent attempt to accommodate somehow with European standards and to reorient, this geopolitical or political thinking from the west to the south. But I do believe that the north and southern dimension of Ukraine is of no less importance comparing with the east-west, this, old good geopolitical and geocultural schema. So I would be in favor, but I don't believe that it is possible in the nearest future.
I'm sure we'll hear more on the subject when we have the session devoted to Crimea with Professor Hakan Kirimli. But now let me open the floor to questions, and I think that rather than bundling, which is my preferred way, is we'll go one by one because time is short and we'll have as many questions as time allows. So let me invite you.
Okay.
James Scher, please.
Do I need a microphone or not? Yes, I mean, there aren't microphones.
Please, it's all recorded.
I don't mind shouting, but you might mind. I just can't resist following up this recent exchange, and I know the discussion will be broadened when we discuss Crimea. But if I may, I would support Professor Kravchenko's answer to you, because to add to all these questions the issue of the Black Sea means shouldering a responsibility to deal with a whole other identity complex and geopolitical complex, which is Turkey. And I think this realistically overburdens the issues that Ukraine has to face. So I just say that as a make that comment as a footnote in support of the answer you received. Thank you.
There may be a middle way because Turkey still has very strong proponents of a European orientation and accession, as does Ukraine. It might be, enter Europe together or as partners.
I will, from this one, been wanting that Ariel would have been, if Ariel Cohen was here, he would have, at one of our conferences, he would have said, in the 17th century, there were three great powers that were vying over Ukraine. They were the Ottoman Empire, Polish Rzeczpospolita, and I see Minister Janusz Januszkiewicz here and Janusz Bugajski, so in their honor, and Muscovy. And it's interesting, Ariel's point to us was 2 out of 3 are now in NATO. It's a democracy globally. they vote Ukraine into NATO. This was at a NATO conference. And so that's the way we might be able to settle it. That might be the context, because I agree that the European context might be difficult, but the NATO context, or a security context, might allow for some of the issues that Lubko, you've raised. So.
Well, if there are no questions, I note that people will be storing much of this information as food for thought, and maybe it will come out in some of the subsequent discussions. I think we have actually kept to our time limit. So let me thank my speaker, Professor Kravchenko, you for your attention, and we'll move on.
Thank you very much.